It was the blizzard of '87. That's what folks called it. That was the year I saw the Panther. Blizzards are nearly as rare as panthers in these parts, and that winter I saw them both. We were huddled like the lone survivors of some grim apocalypse around a wood-burning stove, a small iron belly hissing and groaning as it fired, digesting various forms of wood, and we drew as close as we dared to it without ourselves being consumed. The power was off. Small candles pitched little fits against the darkness in corners. The only sound in the room was the steady monotone ticking of the pendulum clock on the wall somewhere in the darkness, marking the time and its place there. Outside, the snow was still falling, 18 inches or more on the ground, and no sign of letting up anytime soon. The whole county was shut down. No power, stores closed, schools closed, and its residents reduced to hermitry in their various abodes, fending for themselves and against the cold. And we, of the modern generation, having no truck with such difficulties, gathered together in Grandma and Grandpa's house, for they had seen such days and survived them, and not only survived them, but reveled in them.
Papa, for his part, was sleeping in one of the back rooms, but Mama was diligent in the kitchen, scuttling about by the light off a lone, dim candle, arranging canned goods for the coming hard times. For our parts, we were huddled and bored, staring mindlessly at the sparks of heat through the stove vent, or off at the darkness, or nothing. It was me and a couple of cousins and my 2 uncles there, and after some time, someone said, "Let's play Monopoly." Monopoly, for us, was more than a mere game. It was a cutthroat life-or-death situation, as dire as any standoff between nations. We were nations unto ourselves, amassing empires and reducing empires to ruin. We were petty dictators, and we would defend our monarchies to the death, if necessary. Thankfully, it was seldom necessary. Short of murder, we would resort to any means necessary to build and defend our kingdoms of dog-eared cardboard deeds and little plastic hotels. We would evict our own kin, send them out into the streets to fend for themselves. Racketeering, extortion, antitrust violations. The rules for Monopoly, we felt, were more fluid than concrete, and we stirred that vat of viscous Parker Brothers Constitution until we had made our own game of it, really.
One enterprising cousin had developed a kind of insurance policy where if you paid him $100 every time you passed go, he would cover your debts for that time around the board. Another uncle would buy your debt in exchange for 1/3 of your future earnings. We were having a good time, and Mama had popped us some popcorn over the fire, had stood there and shook the pan until it popped like in the old days, and she had melted butter there and poured it over the popcorn till it sparkled with the yellow gelatinous goo. My uncle had just meticulously laid out an unescapable trap around the free parking corner, and I had just rolled 7, which would bring my squander like an unsuspecting fly into that sticky tangle of oranges and yellows, when a cry rang out from deep in the dark woods beyond the house. It was a wild, feminine, almost strangled scream that seemed to bounce like a pinball through the dark hollows and twisted trees, as if it didn't know where to go or who to find. But it found us, huddled in the dim light of a Coleman lantern, with our pretend money scattered about us, tinged at their ends from our buttery fingers. Even in our primitive surroundings, with our primitive light and primitive heat, that scream slipped into our ears and directed our brains to a thing more primitive than us, perhaps even more primitive than fire. Ghostly, ancient, cursed, and reaching out of the dark in thin, ominous tendrils. We were frozen in silence, and I realized like an impartial observer that the question had escaped my lips before I knew the words had been formed in my throat.
What was that? My cousins looked back and forth at each other in the dim orange light, but it was my uncle, the sage of this night, who was to speak in answer. "That was a panther," he said, like it was nothing more than a declaration that the sky is blue. "A panther?" someone said. "Black panther," my uncle continued. "Folks said to hear him sounded like a woman screaming. About like that right there." The scream came again, as if on cue. My uncle, the type of uncle to never miss an opportunity to terrify or enrapture his nieces and nephews, moved slightly out of the waning light of candles and into the powerless dark to speak. "It ain't really a panther," he he began. That's just what the old-timers call them. What it is a lion. But not like the lions that prowl the Serengeti. We listened, enraptured. My uncle, not educated in the traditional sense, and not traveled, but self-educated and traveled, in that he had a monthly subscription to the National Geographic, which in our eyes qualified him as an expert in all things geographical, as well as biological, had a way of holding your attention, especially when your own reading habits were of the sort that had pages full of frames and little dialogue bubbles that protruded up from the mouths of sneering extraterrestrial villains and lantern-jawed heroes, went on and on about the various differences between the Panther leo, or the African lion, and the puma concolor, or the American mountain lion. The reason folks called it a panther and not a lion, he continued, is because to their minds it looked more like a panther than a lion, because all anybody ever knew about lions was what they saw on The Wizard of Oz. In fact, some of the older folks called it a painter and not a panther at all. So you might hear somebody say, "I seen a black painter up in the hills the other night." If you didn't know no better, you'd think you'd seen a Negro with one of those painter hats and an easel up there painting. He laughed. We didn't laugh. The scream had come again, quieting any notion of comedic relief from our hearts.
"Your Grandma Morton seen one when she was a little girl," my uncle said. "Told me about it once. She was about 11 or 12, and you know your grandma wasn't one for embellishing stories." We looked at him, looked at each other, looked at him again. "Making things up," he explained. "Anyhow, she was at the old farm on Smoky, and she was carrying a basket of sweet potatoes from out of the garden to the house, when she saw something out of the corner of her eye. She said it was like a dark shape, and she stopped and looked back at the edge of the barn. She seen this like creature that was kind of hunched over with its head down and its shoulders up, and it was looking at her. Looked like a giant cat. It was a cat, she said, but it was big as a dog. Bigger. And it wasn't no bobcat. Your mama had seen enough of the woods to know the difference in a bobcat and what she was looking at now. Well, she took it awful fright, and she kind of froze there, just staring at it while it stared back at her. Said its eyes was almost red, but it was more like the feeling she got because they were just staring right at her so hard, like they might burn right through her. Said she must have stood there for a minute or two looking, and that thing looking right back at her. Then she said she got her feet to working, and she started kind of backing up real slow, still going toward the house, but with her back to the house, her eyes on that thing sitting there looking at her. Soon as she started to move, she said, that thing lowered its head down, just about to the ground, but it kept its eyes looking up at her. She kept on easing back, she said, and that thing just kept watching her. Then her heel stumped on something, and she staggered a bit and caught herself. But the change in her movement sparked some internal instinct in the beast, and it leapt, pushing its great bulk forward with its hind legs into the air. And she said it felt like 5 or 6 seconds before all 4 of its feet hit the ground. Mama said she turned to run, dropped her basket of sweet potatoes, and just started running toward the house. She didn't look behind her, she just kept right on running till she got up on the front porch and clawed the door open and got in the house. She expected to hear that big cat slam itself up against the door behind her, but she didn't hear nothing. She went over to the window and looked out into the yard, and she seen that big cat stop there, right where she had dropped them sweet potatoes, and it was like pawing around at them on the ground. Wasn't trying to eat them or anything, just kind of pushing them around and looking at them like it didn't know what to make of them. Then after a little bit, it put its head down and walked back toward the barn and off into the woods behind it there. One of my cousins said, "How come you reckon that panther to stop at them taters?" My uncle thought for a moment. "I've thought about that," he began. "I read somewhere that over there in that Transylvania where vampires is supposed to come from, that if a vampire is ever after you, that you throw a pinch of salt over your shoulder behind you. And then the vampire has to stop and count the grains of salt, because vampires is like obsessive compulsive or something like that. Maybe them panthers is the same way." We all sat there in the dark candlelight, the Monopoly board lay neglected before us, thousands of dollars of play money strewn about like the aftermath of some great apocalypse, rendered useless now by the descent of greater, weightier things.
The screaming had stopped for a time, but I knew that we would all be hearing it again in our dreams. The next morning, the weather had broken, and everything was white and deep. I bundled up to walk home. The walk was down my grandparents' driveway, not yet slick, but deep with a foot or so of snow, and then across Shields View Road and up my own driveway. We lived on the side of a mountain. In those days, only poor people lived on the sides of mountains. A man would carve himself a little ledge on the side of a mountain, build himself a little house there, and wear out 3 or 4 cars by the time his firstborn starting school, driving up and down his impossible driveway. And so I sloshed and staggered and stammered down my grandparents' driveway and up my own, passing our own car parked there on the shoulder of Shields View Road, my father having the foresight to park it there before the blizzard, knowing that once the snow fell on our driveway, there would be no going up or down it, and into my house and my room, where I began peeling off the layers of coats and things and sat on my bed to ruminate on the things I had heard the night before. Later that day, I went outside to get myself some snow to make some snow cream. I had my stainless steel bowl, because snow cream tastes better in a stainless steel bowl. Mom and Dad had bought them from a late-night TV infomercial, where they had these guys running over these Japanese stainless steel bowls with trucks and things, and they didn't dent at all. They were like the DeLoreans of bowls. And one was out at the front of the house, looking for a safe place to gather snow, and I saw it was piled up about 8 inches high on the rail fence that lines the edge of our property, and so I went over to gather up a bowl full of snow. On the other side of the fence, the bluff ran nearly straight down about 200 feet to Ownby Circle Road, and across Ownby Circle Road, Ode and Ruby Williams lived in their little house at the base of another bluff that ran straight up behind them. You could stand by the fence and see straight across to another mountainous bluff, like those in cities can stare out the windows of high-rise apartments into the windows of another high-rise apartment. I looked over into the dark woods across the valley, thinking about the Panther. And then, as if hearing my thoughts, I saw. I tell you, I did. No one believed me, but I saw it. About 100 yards or so away, in stark contrast to the snow that covered the sloping bluff, the Panther stood. It looked as big as a dog. Bigger, but it was a cat. There was no mistaking that. Its lean symmetry was unmistakable. I knew then, as only a boy of the mountains can know, that it was my duty to kill this beast. But how? I wasn't allowed to own a rifle. The closest thing I had was an air pump BB gun. There was my compound bow, which I was certain could reach the beast from there. But there was the issue of Ode and Ruby below. Ode and Ruby were good neighbors, but there was one point of tension between our family and them, and that was the fact that periodically a basketball would come flying down the side of the bluff and land in Ode's yard or driveway, or on at least one occasion, Ode's head, at which he would yell up from his house, "You kids, come and get your ball!" If a wayward basketball could cause that much consternation from old Ode, I shuddered to think what a wayward arrow would do. It would have to be the BB gun. Though I knew that a BB gun couldn't kill a panther, I thought that maybe I could hit it in the eye or something, because I was a pretty good shot. I knew, of course, that there was no hope of making such a singular shot from this distance, but I wanted to shoot something at the thing, to let it know that I'd seen it, and that I'd be coming after it. I went back in the house, replaced the steel bowl in the cupboard. This was no time for snow cream. This was a time for battle, and retrieved my BB gun from the rack where it hung, just above my compound bow. When I returned to the fence, the animal had moved, and for a few moments I could not find it. It had lumbered or loped a few dozen feet further along the periphery of the slope. My BB gun was equipped with a scope, and I looked through it to try to surmise the symmetry of my foe a bit better, but it was a cheap scope and afforded little more clarification of its dimensions. I made sure there were BBs in the gun, and then I started pumping. The recommended procedure stamped on the stock of the gun said to pump no more than 3 times, but I was sure the manufacturers had not considered the power required for panther slaying, so I pumped it at least 10 times, struggling so that on the last 2, I actually had to lay the rifle on the ground and push the pumping lever home with my foot. I cleared off a section of snow from the top rail of the fence, and like a seasoned sniper, I leaned my elbow across it and brought the rifle to my shoulder and leaned forward and sighted up the beast through my rifle scope. I put the crosshairs just above the thing's head, adjusting for distance, and fired. The animal did not move, so I repeated the process, straining with everything in me to pump the rifle 12 times. Then, loaded for bear, as they say, I leaned on the fence again, sighted her up, and fired. But again, nothing. I realized then that this foe would require closer combat, and so I went inside to make my plans to both track and slay the beast. I spent the next day getting ready. I got dressed in my camo pants and shirt, my camo jacket with fleece liner, and I put on my black beret with a scarf draped down over my ears so I'd look like the character Robert from the movie Red Dawn, who single-handedly faced down a Russian chopper. Of course, he got blown up, but I wasn't counting on this Panther having any missiles in her arsenal. I filled my army surplus rucksack with some foodstuffs, beanie weenies and crackers and beef jerky and such, and I put in some assorted first aid materials and some extra BBs and various other things. The bulk of what I would need for the hunt was contained in my genuine Rambo survival knife. It had an 8-inch blade, serrated on one side for cutting down trees and such, and I had sharpened it to a fine edge. The real magic, however, was in the handle. It was a hollow handle, and inside were stored a needle and fishing line for fishing or suturing up a wound, a little packet of fish hooks and sinkers, and a pack of waterproof matches. The end of the handle was a compass. I sheathed it in my belt, pulled on my army surplus jungle boots, loaded the quiver that was mounted on my bow with arrows, slung my BB gun over my shoulder, pulled on my pack, grabbed my bow, and I set off into the dark woods to find and to kill the panther.
It was about early afternoon when I went into the woods to find the beast. Down at the back of the property, where the steepness is less steep and feet find better purchases there, beneath the arching canopy of mountain laurel and rhododendron. It's more like a jungle down there, dark and twisted, with a million tangles of things growing from the ground, and the ground seemingly alive beneath your feet. There was not much snow there, on account of the overgrowth, almost woven like a net about 10 feet above your head. There was a place I knew to set up camp, a few dozen yards in, an old dead, overturned pine tree that had fallen at the roots, its big swollen root ball having redeposited a quantity of earth from the hole it had occupied, leaving a hole there in its shadow, a kind of shelter for frozen hunters such as myself. I sat there, deposited my rucksack and my weapons, and then dug into the rucksack for my secret weapon, a paper grocery sack full of marbles. Knowing what I knew of the animal's affinity for counting spilled objects, I planned to deposit spills of marbles around my camp, and while the beast was preoccupied with counting, I would shoot him with my bow and arrow. Having thus deposited my bait, I sat back in the hollow and waited. And I waited, and I waited, and it started getting dark, and dark, and darker, and cold, and scary. And I started thinking to myself, that panther ain't really hurting anybody. I mean, sure, it sounds kind of scary, but old William sounds kind of scary sometimes, and ain't nobody looking to shoot him with a bow and arrow. Live and let live, that's my policy. So I gathered up all my things and left that holler and scrambled back up the bluff to the warmth of my house, and there I stayed. But the story doesn't end there. The next day, I discovered that Crook, the bulldog that belonged to my grandparents, was missing. Crook was a formidable dog with a harsh face, massive jaws, and broad shoulders that made his legs bow out in a cartoonish way. But there was nothing funny about him. And now, he was gone. He had never been gone before. All of our dogs were free-range dogs who required neither pen nor chain, but they never strayed far and were always home at supper time. Crook had now missed 2 supper times. We set out to the woods to look for him. We found nothing of him that whole day. The next day, one of my cousins discovered him, holed up in the woods, bloody and near death. We brought him out and took him to the vet. The vet cleaned him up, took a look at him, and said, "Looks like a cat has got hold of him." And he wondered aloud what kind of cat could have done this much damage to a dog like Crook. But I knew. If you enjoyed this story, please consider dropping a tip in the tip jar. If you like original stories set in Appalachia, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell for notification. Thank you kindly for your time.